You visited Syria last year and released a report about your trip in which you mentioned that about 90% of people in Syria lived below the poverty line and infrastructure had been destroyed by hostilities, and access to necessary equipment for essentials such as food, clean water, electricity, etc. was in much need. And that was especially the case in 2019 when the Caesar sanctions went into effect. So could you explain to us the impact of the comprehensive sanctions put upon Syria before the earthquake, and also how that has worsened the overall humanitarian situation in the country now?
I finished my country visit to Syria on the 10th of November of 2022, and I have released the end of mission statement. It's not the final report still. The final report will be presented to the Human Rights Council in September 2023. So basically, I still continue to collect information, and naturally, I will include all the challenges and all the problems which have happened in the aftermath or as a result of the earthquake. As concerned the impact of unilateral sanctions, that's why I'm welcoming any information in this sphere. As concerned the observations which I have received during the country visit, my purpose within that very short period, 10 working days is very short, trying to understand the impact of unilateral sanctions on all sorts of human rights over all people in Syria. I reflected in the end of mission statement not only the issue of poverty, but also the very fact that the use of unilateral sanctions, especially those preventing the reconstruction of the critical infrastructure, is enormous. So it affects all sorts of human rights, starting from the right to life, the most important one, up to the right to education, right to access internet, right to development, environmental rights. Because naturally, when people live in poverty and they can't afford to get fuel, they are cutting woods, they are engaging in environmental non-friendly technologies, they are starting to engage in criminality if they are not able to get a normal job. And that's especially valid in the situation of Syria, when the country and the infrastructure of the country has been much affected by 12 years of military hostilities, and plus by 12 years of impossibility to provide necessary maintenance to the equipment, as well as to all elements of essential infrastructure, including water, electricity, phone, transportation, communication, education, and even issuing ID licenses. There are a number of internal displaced persons, many of them were children, born during the period of the conflict, or those who have lost all their relatives and friends, and they do not have any idea who are they when they were born and what they're supposed to do for a living.
It's been a week since the deadly earthquake hit Turkey and Syria, and tens of thousands of people have died, and the numbers are still rising. So what's urgently needed to help the Turkish and Syrian people right now?
Well, I need to mention that I'm not in Syria right now. That's why I'm not working on the ground. So I can only rely on my experience on the needs of people, which I have observed during my country visit, as well as the information which I have received from the non-governmental organizations, both national and international and faith-based, which are currently working in Syria. From the general perspective, Syria and the people of Syria have observed very severe difficulties in getting any access to humanitarian assistance even before the earthquake. So they have to struggle, impossibility to get bank transfer. There could be like a very limited possibility to get minor amounts of money from their friends and relatives abroad via Havala system only, not via the fast-track bank transfers. Humanitarian organizations, we are not able to deliver anything besides food and medicine, and even those were in very limited scope. There was no free flow, and there was no possibility to deliver any goods which couldn't be qualified as the emergency relief. But for example, we are about maintaining the electricity and water supply infrastructure. However, despite the fact that all these had devastating effect on the right to health, for example, and even the right to life. After the earthquake, naturally, there is a high need in medicine, medical equipment to provide the assistance. And I can say that when I was visiting Syria, many hospitals have been destroyed. And during the complexity of the military hostilities and the consequences of military hostilities of everything what was happening in Syria for 12 years, many hospitals have been moved to the regular buildings of clinics, not providing for the possibility of intensive therapy, for example. Many hospitals were lacking necessary equipment, for example, CT scanners, which are necessary, especially when people are wounded. And many hospitals were not able to get even basic medical staff, like, for example, Cancer Hospital was complaining that they have to ask people to buy regular cassetters for chemotherapy because they can't get the necessary quantity of those. So therefore, due to the earthquake, the situation with buildings and the situation with medical equipment has naturally deteriorated, and there is a need of free flow of medical equipment. One of the problems which has also been observed is that if some medicine could still be delivered, but spare parts for medical equipment and medical equipment as well were delivered with enormous complexity in the extremely lengthy process. That's why what's currently important is to get this equipment immediately. Point number 2, as far as despite the problems which already existed in Syria, many people have lost their shelters and lost all their belongings, and that means that they need everything starting from clothes, baby formulas, blankets, shelters, to save their lives because it's winter, it's pretty cold in Syria.
Yes.
Another point which has been noted by a number of humanitarian organizations, there is a need for rescue machinery and there is a need for recovery machinery. Unfortunately, none of that has been allowed to be delivered via humanitarian exception mechanism, and that's why the free flow of this machinery is very important, as well as, for example, fuel. There is, you might have a vehicle, but if you do not have sufficient fuel, you can't go somewhere and rescue people.
Syrian officials has also said that the U.S. sanctions have made it extremely difficult for Syrian people to conduct search and rescue operations to save victims buried under the rubble, and they do not have the required equipment for the job. In the meantime, the United States said the earthquake won't change their decision to sanction Syria because their sanctions will not stand in the way of life-saving efforts for Syrian people. So what's your take on that?
As I have mentioned, existing humanitarian exceptions do not provide for the possibility to deliver the necessary life-saving and rescue equipment. The only possible goods which traditionally could be delivered was some food and some medicine, although in a very long and complicated process. The United States have recently adopted the general license, if I'm not mistaken, number 23. So it was done on the 8th of February, providing for certain exceptions. However, these exceptions are not sufficient because they are focusing on the possibility to deliver some goods and receive some financial transfers for the recovery rescue purposes only. But unfortunately, for an average person as well as for any bank, it's very complicated to understand what is the red line between the recovery process and the rescue process and, for example, reconstruction. People in Syria used to have 2 hours, sometimes 1 hour of electricity per day. They used to have huge problems in getting access to clean water. To some regions of Syria, clean water, drinking water could only be delivered by trucks. And now, after the earthquake, it became much more complicated due to the shortage of trucks, due to the shortage of fuel, as well as due to the threats which were happening to the power station, which has not been properly maintained for 12 years, taking into account that no spare parts as well as no new equipment could be delivered due to humanitarian, very narrow understanding of humanitarian exceptions. And moreover, it's necessary to stress that Other countries which impose sanctions on Syria are still speaking that their humanitarian exceptions are sufficient. None of them is providing for a general license, even lifting sanctions for a certain period to provide for the possibility of flow. And humanitarian organizations are still obliged to get 2 or sometimes 3 licenses in a very lengthy and complicated process to deliver the basic needs to Syria. So, moreover, I haven't heard any statement from the side of sanctioning countries aimed to avoid overcompliance. Take into account that sanctions over Syria used to be extremely broad. Everyone was scared. Banks were scared to get subjected to enormous fines. Pharmaceutical companies, as well as other producers of critical infrastructure goods, were scared to be accused in receiving money from Syria or to help the government to reconstruct the country, and therefore they prefer zero-risk policy. They prefer not to engage. So no guarantees have been provided. No guarantees have also been provided to humanitarian actors that they won't face any punishment because of getting engaged in the humanitarian work.
We have also learned that fundraising is very difficult as well. For instance, the GoFundMe is forbidden in Syria. So people who are willing to help around the world, they cannot shift or send the donation through that source of platforms. Cargo planes can't land in Syria, and also other services won't be available. So could you tell us more about those details? Could you give us more examples of what you have observed or learned?
Indeed, unfortunately, all the examples you have mentioned, the existing practice, but unfortunately, the number of platforms which can't be used by humanitarian actors for fundraising is much broader. It's not only Go and Fund Me. I have heard from many humanitarian actors that they register to a number of platforms for a very limited period of time, and afterwards either they can't register because of the Syrian IP address or Syrian phone number, or they can only try to get some donations for a very limited period of time. They are usually blocked as far as the fact that they try to collect donations designated for Syria appears. So therefore, unfortunately, that's an issue of online connectivity, using any Syrian IP address, using any phone number, or using anything what identifies Syria or Syrians as a final destination place or the beneficiary of humanitarian assistance makes donations collection very complicated. Moreover, when one speaks about the bigger donors, which, for example, so-called umbrella international organizations which work in different countries around the world, even these organizations face serious challenges in collecting donations to deliver humanitarian aid to Syria, because donors are a little bit reluctant currently to provide humanitarian assistance because of the fear to be accused in supporting the government of Syria, which is under sanctions of the United States and a number of other countries. And moreover, still there are very serious problems in getting licenses to deliver this humanitarian assistance. Some humanitarian organizations are requested to report and to guarantee that none of the humanitarian assistance is used to support the public sector of Syria. And I will give you an example. If, for example, a humanitarian organization wants to do a training for the primary school teachers how to talk to students about their sexual security, it's already support of the public sector if the school is public. Therefore, humanitarian actors face enormous challenges, not only because of the public Syrian banks, as well as to private Syrian banks, which used to be used for international financial transactions, are blocked, but also because of many other impediments. And some of humanitarian organizations have been complained that they faced reputational risks if they identify that they are delivering humanitarian aid to Syria.
Then that leads to my next question. We know last Thursday, 4 days after the deadly earthquake hit Syria, the U.S. Treasury announced a 180-day exemption to its sanctions on Syria to all transactions related to earthquake relief efforts. You just briefly mentioned about it. Then how much of that temporary easing sanctions against Syria help at this point?
Take into account that my main concern is to protect human rights of people in the countries under sanctions and the rights of Syrians naturally suffering because of the catastrophic earthquake. I need to say that I welcome any efforts to suspend, to minimize any types of unilateral sanctions. So anything what can make situation for people on the ground easier. And I guess that it's a good first step. I also, in the press release, which has been signed by me and co-signed by 9 other special mandate holders last Friday, we are welcoming this step, but we are identifying that these measures are not sufficient. So first of all, it's necessary to do at least the same steps by other sanctioning countries. Secondly, I strongly insist that in order to provide people of Syria with the possibility to recover after the earthquake, it's necessary to lift all the sanctions, to open the way for them to rebuild the country, to rebuild critical infrastructure. You can't get access to clean water all around the country if you do not have the water infrastructure functioning. You can't do it if you do not have full-time electricity. For example, in the hospitals during the country visit, even before the earthquake, even hospitals could get electricity access for 11 to 12 hours per day only. Other 12, 13 hours per day, they were trying to fill this gap via the use of fuel, like the diesel fuel, but there is a huge problem with access availability of diesel fuel around the country as well. So as I have mentioned that issuing this general license number 23 is good, but it's not sufficient because unfortunately it doesn't lift all the sanctions first. Secondly, it doesn't draw a clear line between the reconstruction and post-earthquake recovery. And from the experience of working within the mandate, I believe that the banks and businesses will still try to follow the zero-risk policy. That means that over-compliance from the side of private donors, private actors, banks, businesses, transportation and delivery companies will still be at place. Third, this exception refers to the possibility of delivery of specific sorts of goods. There are no guarantees for humanitarian actors that they will stay unpunished for delivery of humanitarian aid, which, for example, could be qualified as reconstruction goods. So to wash hands, you need to have water. If you help to reconstruct water facilities, is it reconstruction or after earthquake relief? No guarantees were issued. No request to stop over-compliance and zero-risk policies were given. No request upon businesses not to over-comply with sanctions regime and to follow the lifting of sanctions and to provide for the possibility of financial flows have been given. So I guess that really doing this general license is good. It will give some possibility to deliver humanitarian aid more than it was before, but it's definitely not sufficient.
So as a professor in law, what's your assessment of the U.S. long-arm jurisdiction practice over the years? Because obviously Syria is one of the very classical case, like how the U.S. has imposed this sanction under its so-called long-arm jurisdiction, and how does that sanctions violate the international rule of law?
Well, as a professor of international law, I'm always calling all states and especially states which impose sanctions to have a very precautionary approach to the observance of the international legal obligations. And I call all states to behave in accordance with international law standards. Unfortunately, the use of unilateral sanctions doesn't fit either the existence of authorization of the UN Security Council, because no authorization exists, And secondly, it doesn't address it doesn't conform the criteria of countermeasures. Therefore, it violates international law. The issue of extraterritoriality is very important on the point, and this issue has no ground in international law. States can only act within their own jurisdiction. Using unilateral sanctions, for example, bringing criminal states can only, for example, start a criminal case if it has jurisdiction. Using payments in US dollars is not the ground for jurisdiction. Expressing some sort of concerns about worldwide interests from the side of international law, states can only act if erga omnes obligation, that means obligations owed to the international community as a whole, in the cases of, for example, genocide, or in the cases of aggression, are at stake. In any other case, there is no ground for that. And moreover, the issue of imposing sanction on the ground of announcing the state of national emergency, as it follows from the recent practice of the United States, has nothing to do with Article 4 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which provides clear-cut limitation to announce the state of national emergency. Moreover, the Human Rights Council, as well as UN treaty organs, as well as the Universal Periodic Review, has repeatedly underlined that the US is acting in a violation of Article 4 of ICCPR when announcing any types of national emergency situation. So therefore, it can't be used as a ground for imposition of sanctions and for the use of extraterritorial jurisdiction. Similarly, the use of secondary sanctions as well as civil and criminal penalties to the nationals of third countries for violation of sanctions regime doesn't fit within jurisdiction of any countries and has no grounds in international law.